Hey everyone, this is a piece titled Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, and the Left Opposition in the USSR, 1918 to 1928. I'm going to read Yuri Felshtinsky's Wikipedia page. Yuri Felshtinsky was born in 1956 in Moscow and is a Russian-American historian. Yuri Felshtinsky has authored a number of books on Russian history, including The Bolsheviks and the Left SRs, 1985, Towards a History of Our Isolation, 1988, The Failure of the World Revolution, 1991, Blowing Up Russia with Alexander Litvinenko, and The Age of Assassins with Vladimir Priblovsky. It says, Felshtinsky has published a number of books on the history of the communist movement. In one of those books, Leaders, the Mobsters, he describes the Bolshevik Party as a mafia-like organization where, quote, almost no one died by a natural cause, end quote. According to Felshtinsky, the list of assassinations includes poisoning of Vladimir Lenin, Felix Dzerzhinsky, and Maxim Gorky by Genrikh Yagoda, on orders from Joseph Stalin, murders of Mikhail Frunze, Vyacheslav Menzinsky, and Leon Trotsky, and the poisoning of Stalin by associates of Lavrenti Beria. In 1998, Felshtinsky traveled back to Moscow in order to study the politics of contemporary Russia. At that time, Felshtinsky became acquainted with Alexander Litvinenko, a lieutenant colonel of the Federal Security Service, FSB. In 1920, Felshtinsky and Litvinenko began working on Blowing Up Russia, a book that describes the gradual appropriation of power in Russia by the security apparatus and details the FSB's involvement in a series of terrorist attacks that took place between 1994 and 1999. In 2001, several chapters from Blowing Up Russia were published in a special edition of the newspaper Novaya Gazeta. In 2002, the book became the basis for a documentary film titled Blowing Up Russia, also known as Assassination of Russia. Both the book and the documentary are officially banned in Russia for, quote, divulging state secrets, end quote. Until 2006, Felshtinsky continued working with Litvinenko on gathering additional materials documenting the FSB's involvement in the apartment house bombings of September 1999. According to the authors, the bombings were committed by the Russian Federal Security Service as a false flag operation intended to justify the Second Chechen War. In November 2006, Litvinenko died in London of acute radiation syndrome 3 weeks after being poisoned with polonium-210. See poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko. In 2007, investigator Mikhail Trapashkin said that, according to his FSB sources, quote, everyone who was involved in the publication of the book Blowing Up Russia will be killed, end quote, and that 3 FSB agents had made a trip to Boston to prepare the assassination of Felshtinsky. After the death of exiled oligarch Boris Berezovsky, who sponsored the book, Felshtinsky suggested that Berezovsky was killed. Okay, that's quite a story. Here we go. Here's the article. Lenin, Trotsky, Stalin, and the Left Opposition in the USSR, 1918 to 1928. The year 1928 can be considered a major line of demarcation in Soviet history for a whole series of reasons. Internally, the country terminated the brief existence of the new economic policy, and the forced collectivization of peasant agriculture was begun. In foreign policy, the stormy expansionist decade of 1918 to 1927 ended with the unsuccessful revolution in China and was replaced by the relatively peaceful period of 1928 to 1937. In party politics, the so-called left opposition was liquidated in 1928 as a legitimate political force. The left opposition's brilliant representative was Leon Trotsky. It cannot be said that little historiographical attention has been devoted to Trotsky. A bibliography of Trotsky's writings as well as the works about him would occupy many hundreds of pages. Nevertheless, the reasons for Trotsky's strikingly easy defeat in the struggle for power, and the solitude to which Trotsky was always doomed, which found expression in the absence of personal followers, cannot but surprise the historian, as we cannot fail to be surprised by the swiftness of the fall of the originally numerous and resolute left opposition, the supporters of Trotsky. In this article, an attempt is made to analyze the sources of the left opposition in the Bolshevik Party and the reasons for the left opposition's defeat, as well as the roles played by three Bolshevik leaders, Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin, in the ideological struggle within the Communist Party of the Soviet Union in the first years of Soviet power. The article is based largely on materials from Trotsky's archives preserved by the Houghton Library at Harvard University, portions of which have been published by the author in recent years. Leftist oppositions arose in the USSR on two separate occasions, each time at a moment critical for the Bolshevik system, when it was necessary to resolve serious internal policy issues upon which depended either the very existence of the Soviet government or the success of the revolution in neighboring countries. The classic example of this was the opposition to the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. From the point of view of strict communist interests, the Brest-Litovsk Treaty was a catastrophe. The Brest-Litovsk Treaty totally destroyed any chance that might have existed for a swift revolution in Germany, and therefore signaled the end of hope for immediate revolution in the rest of Europe as well. This was so obvious to the Bolshevik and left Socialist Revolutionary Party actives that the majority of their party officials took a stand in opposition to Lenin's group, supporting instead either the openly leftist position of Nikolai Bukharin, who demanded the declaration of revolutionary war against all imperialists, or the more careful and undoubtedly more, quote, correct, parenthesis, from the point of view of communist interest, and parenthesis, position of Trotsky. Lenin's position, in contrast to that of his opponents, was absolutely rationalistic. Above all else, Lenin was interested in power, even if only for a single day, in a single town, and as soon as possible. A second. Got it. This piece has endnotes as opposed to footnotes, so gotta get to that. Where am I? There's a couple of footnotes that I missed, so I gotta read them all. English scholar Louis Sinclair spent many years compiling Trotsky's his bibliography of Trotsky's works. For another survey of works by and about Trotsky, see Rudolf Benner, something in German, Alte und Neue Trotsky Editionen, and the Jahrbucher Geschichte Osteuropas. A multi-volume Trotsky collection is currently being published in Germany. In the 1970s and early 1980s, Pathfinder Press in New York came out with a collection of Trotsky's works encompassing the period 1923 to 1940. Pathfinder Press being the press of the Socialist Workers' Party. A 24-volume collection of Trotsky's works edited by Pierre Bruet, who edited the Trotsky Notebooks in France, was published in France. Leon Trotsky. To this brief list may be added 3 Trotsky biographies: J. Carmichael's Trotsky, published in 1980, Isaac Deutscher's trilogy, The Prophet Armed, The Prophet Unarmed, and The Prophet Outcast, published in 1954, 1959, and 1963, respectively, and Pierre Bruet's biography, Trotsky. Biographies of Trotsky are beginning to be published in Eastern Europe. In the Soviet Union, a small biographical brochure on Trotsky has been written by the historian V. Startsev, and Hungarian historian Miklos Kun is currently working on a Trotsky biography. That was footnote 1. Note 2. In recent years, the following Trotsky works have been published in the original Russian, edited by the author of this article. Yeah, it's all in Russian. I guess there's a translation. Oh no, it says in the middle of that Philip Pomper, co-editor, Trotsky's Notebooks, 1933 to 1935. I forget. I definitely have a piece of Philip Pomper's. I think it's Philip Pomper. It says P. Pomper. I think it's Philip Pomper on this channel because he had a piece in the Trotsky reappraisal. Might have been on Martov, but I'm not sure. Footnote 3. On the 73rd day of Soviet power in Petrograd, Lenin solemnly declared to Arthur Ransome, a British correspondent for the Manchester Guardian, that the fundamental goal of the Russian Revolution had already been achieved. I'm going to look this person up. Arthur Ransome. Wikipedia says Arthur Ransome lived from 1884 to 1967 and was an English author and journalist. Arthur Ransome is best known for writing and illustrating the Swallows and Amazon series of children's books about the school holiday adventures of children, mostly in the Lake District and the Norfolk Broads. The entire series remains in print, and Swallows and Amazons is the basis for a tourist industry around Windermere and Coniston Water, the two lakes Ransome adapted as his fictional North Country Lake. He also wrote about the literary life of London and about Russia before, during, and after the revolutions of 1917. His connection with the leaders of the revolution led to him providing information to the Secret Intelligence Service, while he was also suspected by MI5 of being a Soviet spy. Okay, back to the text. Still in the footnotes here. On the 73rd day of Soviet power in Petrograd, Lenin solemnly declared to Arthur Ransome, a British correspondent for the Manchester Guardian, that the fundamental goal of the Russian Revolution had already been achieved. The Bolsheviks had held out for one day longer than the Paris Commune, and the fall of Soviet power now would not be terrible, since its most important contribution to the worldwide communist movement had already been made. Next footnote. When Trotsky asked Lenin in 1918 what would happen if the Germans attacked and took Moscow, Lenin answered, quote, "We will retreat further to the east, to the Urals, ... The Kuznetsky Basin is rich in coal. We will form a Ural-Kuznetsky Republic supported by coal-based industry and Kuznets coal, and that portion of the Moscow and Petrograd workers that we could bring with us, ... If necessary, we'll go even further to the east, beyond the Urals. We will go all the way to Kamchatka, but we will hold out," end quote. Lenin. Trotsky commented, quote, "The concept of an Ural-Kuznetsky Republic was organically essential to Lenin, in order to strengthen himself and others in the conviction that nothing was yet lost and there could be no place for a strategy of despair," end quote. Trotsky. I think it's from his Lenin material for a biography. End footnote. In the article titled, I think this is in Russian, Uroki Oktября, published as an introduction to the first part of Trotsky's book 1917, and republished in the book Uroka Oktября. Oh, there's a missing page, so I don't actually have the rest of that footnote. But the show must go on. Only then would it be possible to think about a European revolution. In such a scheme of things, or let me read the last sentence I read. Lenin's position, in contrast to that of Lenin's opponents, was absolutely rationalistic. Above all else, Lenin was interested in power, even if only for a single day, in a single town, and as soon as possible. Only then would it be possible to think about a European revolution. In such a scheme of things, there was no place for either the revolutionary romanticism of the left SRs or the rhetoric of the left communists. More importantly, it also left no room even for a swift revolution in Germany, since in such an event the issue of power in Russia would be deprived of its critical significance. The center of the worldwide communist movement would shift to Berlin, and the Soviet government of the, quote, United States of Europe would be headed by Karl Liebknecht and Rosa Luxemburg, and certainly not by Lenin, with his opportunistic and, quote, rightist idea of a Brest-Litovsk, quote, truce. And there's a footnote here, and it starts on the page that was cut off, but the bottom portion of it is not cut off. So just take a deep breath and listen to me read this shit that's out of context. And Nikolevsky on this subject is not to be found in the Nikolevsky collection at the Hoover Institution archives. Their correspondence was quite extensive, but was devoted primarily to Marx. These letters are also missing from the archive of T. Liebknecht. However, there is an allusion to this correspondence in a letter from Nikolaevsky, I don't know the fucking say his name. Quote, Theodora Liebknecht told me, quote, stated Nikolaevsky, quote, that Karl Liebknecht at their last meeting, parenthesis, on the eve of Karl's arrest, end parenthesis, told Nikolevsky I'm going to repeat that. Quote, Theodora Liebknecht told me, end quote, stated Nikolevsky, quote, that Karl Liebknecht at their last meeting, parenthesis, on the eve of Karl's arrest, end parenthesis, told him that he had found out about Radek, who had just arrived illegally from Moscow, quote, appalling things, end quote, which he promised to recount at the time of their next meeting. That meeting never took place, and Theodora felt that Radek had betrayed Karl. End quote. In a letter to the Italian socialist, A. Balabanova, I forget, is it Angela? I know who this person is. Balabanova. Angelica Alabanova, that's it. And Angelica Balabanova lived from 1878 to 1965 and was a Russian-Italian communist and social democratic activist of Jewish origin. Angelica Balabanova served as the secretary of the Comintern from 1919 to 1920 and later became a political party leader in Italy. All right, back to the text. And this is still that footnote. In a letter to the Italian socialist, Angelica Balabanova, dated the 20th of April, 1962, this letter is found in the archive of the International Institute of Social History, Angelica Balabanova collection. Nikolaevsky spelled out what precisely Karl Liebknecht had found out about Radek. Quote, especially frequently now I recall my past conversations with Theodora Liebknecht, who indicated to me that Radek betrayed Karl, bracket, Liebknecht, end bracket. On the eve of Karl Liebknecht's arrest, he met Theodora on the street and on the way said that he had received information regarding Radek's ties with military circles and considered Radek a traitor. They made arrangements to meet the next day, at which time Karl was to have recounted the details, but that night Karl Liebknecht was arrested and killed. All through the next years, Theodora gathered evidence and told me that he was convinced of the accuracy of his brother's suspicions. ... I regret that I did not take Theodora's stories seriously enough at the time and did not write them down. End quote. Nikolaevsky. Apparently, it says Theodore. I don't know. I guess I was thinking it was like Theodora. It was a woman. I guess this is his brother. I'll quickly read this. Theodor Liebknecht was born in Leipzig in 1870, and was the son of Wilhelm Liebknecht, the famous social democratic politician, and the brother of Karl Liebknecht. Theodor Liebknecht studied law and worked together with his brother Karl and Oskar Kohn as a lawyer in Berlin from 1899 on, becoming politically active after his brother's murder in 1919. Theodor Liebknecht was a member of the Independent Social Democratic Party of Germany, opposed to the merger with the KPD and the joining of the Comintern, but also to the reunification of the party with the SPD. Theodor Liebknecht continued the USPD as an independent party with Georg Ledebour until its merger into the Sozialistische Arbeiterpartei Deutschlands, SAPD, Socialist Workers' Party of Germany, in 1931. In 1922, Theodor Liebknecht accompanied Kurt Rosenfeld, Emila Vandervelde, and Arthur Walter as foreign socialist lawyers who participated in the defense of the socialist revolutionaries in the 1922 Moscow trial of socialist revolutionaries, one of the first show trials, at least according to Simon. I think that's how Simon Parani refers to them, who wrote the great book, The Russian Revolution in Retreat. In 1924, Theodor Liebknecht was involved in the split of the Sozialistischer Bund, together with Georg Ledebour, a right-wing member of the SAPD. Theodor Liebknecht was opposed to the introduction of Leninist schemes of organization into the party. Following the Nazi rise to power, Theodor Liebknecht emigrated to Basel, Switzerland in 1933 and was later employed by the International Institute of Social History in Amsterdam from 1936 to 1939. He was a supporter of the Second and a Half International. Theodor Liebknecht died in Altendorf, Broma, Germany in 1948. Okay, so back to the text. In 1957, Nikolaevsky wrote a letter on the same subject to the former leader of the French Communist Party, Boris Souvarine, who by that time abandoned communism. Quote, I spoke extensively on this subject with Theodor Liebknecht, deceased, who considered both Karl Radek and especially Karl Moore to be agents of the German General Staff. Yeah, I'm not seeing anything for Karl Moore or Mura. I don't know how you say it. It's got the German name Karl, but it looks like Moore, as in like Michael Moore. Anyway, This is Nikolaevsky again. Quote, I spoke extensively on this subject with Theodor Liebknecht, deceased. Should be Theodor Liebknecht, who considered both Karl Radek and especially Karl Moore to be agents of the German General Staff. He assured me that the same conclusion regarding Radek had also been reached by Karl Liebknecht, who had a conversation on this subject with Theodor at their last meeting. Karl, in Theodor's words, was completely crushed by information he had received then from someone for whom Theodor did not know. End quote. This letter is found in the International Institute of Social History, Amsterdam, archive of Boris Souverin, letter from Nikolaevsky to Boris Souverin dated 11th of April 1957. And in 1962, Nikolaevsky wrote to M.N. Pavlovsky, not seeing anything for this guy, who was studying Bolshevik German collaboration in the pre-revolutionary period. Quote, of course, Radek did not participate directly in the assassination of Karl Liebknecht. The subject was something else. The fact that Radek provided them the German Secret Service Liebknecht's address, and in turn they spared Radek from arrest. I have to say I am not certain that everything in Theodor Liebknecht's tales is untrue. Theodor Liebknecht was an absolute honest man, very knowledgeable. Theodor Liebknecht was totally correct regarding Karl Moore. Theodor Liebknecht brought much to light in the affair of his brother's murder, and had some good informants. To me it is unquestionable that Radek was linked with the very major German secret agents. Stalin did not shoot him in 1937, undoubtedly because he figured on using his old contacts, and therefore in this matter we can still run across much that is unexpected, end quote. Nikolaevsky to M.N. Pavlovsky, 1962. Of course, these materials are not in themselves sufficient to allow Radek to be definitely considered one of the organizers behind the assassinations of Liebknecht and Luxemburg, but they are more than adequate to place Radek under suspicion of participating in the murders in some fashion. End footnote. This is really interesting. It's a shame that the first part of the footnote was cut off, but I've never heard this before. But Herman Gorder, if you read his letter from Moscow. I think it's the last meeting, last moment. It's from 1920. And it's the last time that the Communist Workers' Party of Germany would participate in a Comintern Congress. It's so scornful of Radek. It just drips with contempt for him in particular. And there's something else that I read that also held him in a lot of contempt, but I'm not particularly sure who it was. I have to think about that. But very interesting. The players' cards were laid out as follows. On one side was Lenin, striving to strengthen his authority and that of his group. On the other side were the dogmatic idealists, understanding, some intuitively and some on the basis of sound reasoning, that there would be no place for them in any isolated socialist society, and that it was therefore necessary for them to fight for immediate world revolution as the only means of justifying their existence. Footnote. For the left communists, for the supporters of Trotsky, and for the majority of the left SRs, distinguished from the Bolsheviks by their greater dogmatism, the issue of building communism in a single country did not exist. They considered it an impossibility. It is necessary to stipulate one reservation at this point. Ultimately, building communism in a, quote, isolated country turned out to be entirely possible, but doing so, as we now know, necessitated the destruction of those communist romantics who would agree to build it only in accordance with maximalist dogma, rather than proceeding from the actual state of affairs in Soviet Russia. In retrospect, cognizant as we are of Stalin's campaign to purge the old Bolsheviks in 1936 to 1939, it is appropriate to salute the intuition of those who opposed, quote, socialism in the country. They may not have known it at the time, but in defending their views, they were fighting for their lives. End footnote. Lenin won the game. A brilliant tactician in party politics, Lenin outplayed his opponents in time for the Central Committee vote on the Brest-Litovsk Treaty in March 1918, and having made good use of the indecisiveness of Trotsky and the left communists, pushed the treaty through the party Congress, managing also to destroy the rival left SR party during the Congress of Soviets on the 6th of July 1918. After the destruction of the left SRs, Lenin definitively confirmed his power. Definitively confirmed his power. It was only at the end of 1922 that a serious rival for Lenin appeared from within the Politburo, Stalin. Stalin was dangerous above all because, as a good student, Stalin had superbly assimilated the only leadership methods by which it was possible to maintain a hold on the new type of party. Stalin attempted to seize control of Lenin's organization through a personal, quote, secretariat, and nearly made an overt statement of his claim. Footnote. Stalin's intentions were shown by the so-called Georgian affair, by his quarrel with Krupskaya, which was followed by a rift in his personal relations with the dying Lenin, and also his announcement to members of the Politburo, Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev, that Lenin had asked him for poison with which to commit suicide. Trotsky thought that Stalin wished to use this method to hasten Lenin's death. End footnote. Lenin opened the battle. Since the end of 1922, however, Lenin had been not only terminally ill, but also had become somewhat absent-minded and had lost considerable control of the events around Lenin. Lenin created a system of governing, quote, according to Lenin, end quote, which beyond the grasp of anyone other than himself, and proposed to the Politburo a collective leadership, attempting to replace himself with the entire group. Not trusting any single Politburo member enough to name an individual successor, Lenin set forth a, quote, system of deputies, end quote, under which the members of the government would occupy dual posts in different departments, enabling them to watch over each other. Lenin's proposal was not taken seriously in the Politburo. Lenin then drafted the document known as Lenin's, quote, testament, stating the total unfitness of each and every member of the Politburo for the role of head of the government. Lenin again proposed that Lenin be replaced. Lenin again proposed that he be replaced by a collective leadership, and that Stalin be removed from power altogether, but did not state who should replace Stalin, attesting once again to Lenin's uncharacteristic state of mind, end parenthesis. The Politburo chose to ignore this document as well, and it would not be accurate to assume that this document's publication would have been unpleasant for Stalin alone. Lenin's most important miscalculation in this affair was that Lenin wrote a will equally detrimental to all named in the will. When American communist Max Eastman referred to the existence of a Lenin, quote, testament in a book Eastman published in 1925, it was none other than Trotsky who stepped forward with a refutation. It was none other than Trotsky who stepped forward with a refutation. Footnote. See Max Eastman, Since Lenin Died, 1925. Eastman indicated elsewhere that he took down the quotations from the quote testament from the words of three prominent Bolsheviks. The question of how Lenin's quote testament was transmitted to the West and Trotsky's related famous denial also require clarification. One source indicates that during a break between sessions of the 13th Congress, Trotsky, while strolling the corridor, recited the text of Lenin's testament to Eastman, who was a guest at the Congress. Trotsky spoke with care so that he would not be overheard, but did not extract a pledge of silence from Eastman. At about the same time, a Menshevik who had been working on the staff of A. Solz stole the text of the quote testament and smuggled it abroad for publication in the Menshevik publication Sotsialistischeský Vestnik. The Menshevik organ published the document, but its source was discovered and in 1924 executed. The text of the quote testament, held by the Trotsky Archive at Harvard University, is a copy of the Sotsialistischeský Vestnik version, retyped for Trotsky by Boris Nikolaevsky himself. There is reason to suppose that the text of Lenin's testament was also carried abroad by K.H. Rakovsky. I think that might be Christian Rakovsky. This follows from a letter written by Trotsky to Eastman on the 21st of May, 1931. Therefore, when Max Eastman quoted from the quote testament in his book published in English in 1925, Since Lenin Died, it should not have caused any particular sensation. Nevertheless, a considerable sensation resulted. Time magazine carried a reprint of the story of Lenin's testament from Eastman's book. And whereas the Soviet government had chosen not to react to the publication of the document in Sotsialistischeský Vestnik, Trotsky himself responded to the article in Time. Acting on the instructions of the Politburo, Trotsky issued a formal statement denying that a document called Lenin's Testament existed and accused Eastman of lying. Krupskaya came out in print with a similar statement. Somewhat later, Eastman received the full text of the testament through Rakovsky and Suverin, and then, castigated by Trotsky and Krupskaya, Time published the full text of the document. One second. End footnote. Extremely self-confident, Trotsky had not bothered to organize a group of personal partisans around himself. Trotsky was so certain of his own irreplaceability that Trotsky had invested all his trust in the revolution itself. Footnote. When, in forming his alliance with Trotsky in 1917, Lenin suggested to Trotsky that he bring his own people from the Mezryantsy, a group of social democrats standing midway between the Mensheviks and the Bolsheviks, into the Bolshevik Central Committee. Trotsky refused. Trotsky sincerely could not understand why Lenin felt he, Trotsky, should insist on this, since they had, after all, no ideological differences at that point. End footnote. Trotsky was repeatedly proven correct. Even without an organized group of followers, Trotsky was widely considered before October 1917 to be one of the most prominent of the revolutionaries, at a time when Lenin needed both money and an organization of followers to substantiate his own influence. This became particularly evident in 1917 after Lenin's arrival in Petrograd, when Lenin sought the recognition of his group. Trotsky, who had not compromised himself by traveling through Germany, was in essence invited to head the Petrograd Soviet, and it was Trotsky, not Lenin, who remained underground following his most recent failure, the unsuccessful attempted coup in July, who organized the seizure of power by the Petrograd Soviet, in which the Bolsheviks held a strong majority. Lenin appeared openly in public for the first time only after the uprising was over. On the 26th of October, at the Second Congress of Soviets, Lenin assumed the authority seized for him by Trotsky and took control of the new government that, in essence, should have been led by Trotsky himself. Footnote: one of the reasons Trotsky was not asked to head the Sovnarkom, the Council of People's Commissars, was apparently Trotsky's nationality. It was generally considered inappropriate for a Jew to be appointed a head of state. For this reason, there were no Jews on the Sovnarkom staff other than Trotsky. After Lenin's death, Rykov, a Russian, became chairman of the Sovnarkom rather than Zinoviev or Kamenev, both of whom were Jews. End footnote. End footnote. Regardless of any disagreements they may have had, the post-October period is therefore distinguished by the closeness of the relationship between Lenin and Trotsky. Until the seizure of power, Trotsky was a rival for leadership of the movement, and Lenin struggled against him any way he could. But once Lenin was convinced that this brilliant revolutionary was interested only in the revolution as such, and not in power, Lenin came to see in Trotsky only an ally and a friend. Footnote: Lenin and Trotsky had disagreements, but Lenin trusted Trotsky, and every critical moment relied upon Trotsky. The history of Trotsky and Lenin's relationship is complex, but it is obvious that Lenin's relations with many of the leading Bolsheviks were complicated. Lenin proposed expelling Zinoviev and Kamenev from the party for opposing the 1917 October Revolution. Lenin proposed removing Stalin from the post of General Secretary in 1923, and Lenin's relations with Bukharin were in fact broken off in the months of the Brest-Litovsk negotiations. Dzerzhinsky fell into disfavor with Lenin after the events of the 6th to 7th of July, when Lenin suspected Dzerzhinsky of participating in plans to assassinate the German ambassador to Moscow, Count Mirbach. It also is probable that Sverdlov's loss of authority in the last months of his life was the result of difficulties with Lenin. Trotsky was literally the only Bolshevik who did not enter into serious conflict with Lenin after October 1917. Their pre-revolutionary conflicts had been washed away by the revolution. End footnote. In 1923, trying unsuccessfully to oust Stalin, Lenin proposed an alliance to Trotsky. More precisely, if Lenin's illness is taken into account, Lenin asked Trotsky for help. But Trotsky refused. Trotsky wanted no part of Lenin's intrigues, even when the target was Stalin, whom Trotsky had always detested and regarded as an inferior. Trotsky therefore not only refused to join Lenin in common battle, but pointedly took up a neutral position. There was a certain amount of calculation in this decision. At the moment of Lenin's death in January of 1924, To whom, if not Trotsky, should the leadership of the Soviet government have belonged? And Trotsky did not rush to assert Trotsky's power by leaving the southern town of Sukhum in order to attend Lenin's funeral. In complete accordance with his principles, he waited for the Politburo to extend him an invitation to leadership, but the Politburo issued no such invitation. It was at this moment, essentially, that the Trotsky opposition, or more precisely the opposition to Trotsky, was born. The naming of Rykov to Lenin's post as chairman of the Sovnarkom amplified the relative authority of the more senior Stalin in his post as general secretary. The opposition initially consisted of Trotsky alone, standing against the majority of the Politburo led by Zinoviev, Kamenev, and Stalin, Trotsky relying on only on revolutionary truisms and not on a personal mafia-type organization, at first did not want to admit that they were opposing Trotsky, and having finally recognized it as a fact, Trotsky could not understand why. Trotsky was absolutely correct when Trotsky later indicated that his conflict with Stalin began before the death of Lenin. But the conflict does not in itself explain anything. Trotsky had even greater conflicts with Lenin. Trotsky then began to formulate, totally in the spirit of Marxism, an entire theory, in which the most frequently repeated words were, quote, thermidor and, quote, bureaucratism, in an attempt to explain the nature of Stalinism and the essence of his disagreement with Stalinism. Trotsky held Lenin, the system, and Trotsky's self totally blameless. Only in 1934 did he write in his diary, quote, Lenin created the apparatus created Stalin, end quote. Apparently that's on page 129 of Trotsky's notebooks. Footnote. There's another footnote that I missed. Footnote. Attempts have repeatedly been made to explain Trotsky's behavior during these months by Trotsky himself and by historians of the Communist Party. At least one additional hypothesis can be added to those already proposed. Trotsky, always holding himself apart from the group and considered an outsider in the Bolshevik Party, chose not to support Lenin in the hope that the escalating power struggle between Lenin on one side and Stalin, Zinoviev, Kamenev on the other would discredit the, quote, troika in the eyes of the party actives, and thus strengthen his own authority. End footnote. Footnote. The fact that Trotsky did not at this time consider opposing the Politburo is demonstrated by the presentation of the Declaration of the 46th to the Politburo on the 15th of October 1923, criticizing the policies of the government majority. Trotsky's signature is not among the 46 on this document. End footnote. Trotsky's isolation in the face of the Politburo majority's original battle against Trotsky and the surprising solidarity the Politburo demonstrated in their persecution of Trotsky in 1924 to 1925 can be explained to a certain extent by psychological factors. The resplendent Trotsky was openly detested in party circles for Trotsky's self-assuredness bordering on arrogance, for the too distinct brilliance of Trotsky's nature. It is not accidental that Trotsky, gradually ostracized and excluded from the business of the day, turned out in those years to have no sympathizers, which is attested by the nearly total absence from Trotsky's archives of documents and letters for the years 1924 to 1925. Trotsky had no one with whom to correspond. Footnote. Among the archival materials of 1924, There is only one such document, Our Disagreements, a verbose article written in November in response to the critics of his earlier article, Urokai Octobria, or Octiabria. In reading it, one is startled by Trotsky's sincerity and his inability to understand why this article, a 40-page apologia on behalf of the party and Lenin, provoked the censor of the most prominent party officials, Zinoviev, Kamenev, E. Kivering, O. Kusanin, G. Sokolnikov, Stalin, and Bukharin, and the editor of Pravda. Trotsky attempted to discover the underlying reasons for their disagreements, at a time when the issue was a straightforward struggle against Trotsky himself. Quote, Our Disagreements is striking in its naivety. It is not surprising that a few months later, instead of using the army as Trotsky's base and standing in opposition to the party majority, on the 15th of January 1925, Trotsky voluntarily resigned his post as chairman of the Revolutionary Military Council, thus surrendering any real power at his command. See the letter from Trotsky regarding his resignation in Max Eastman, since Lenin died. The Russian text of this letter was published in the same year as a separate brochure under the title, it says, Otstavka Trotskogo. I don't know. Which translates as The Resignation of Trotsky, Central Committee Meeting of the 17th of January 1925. Trotsky remained a politically naive man until the end of his life. He thus could not comprehend that power had been transferred to the bureaucrats of the party apparatus, and was no longer held by the revolutionaries of the October days. It is not surprising that at the end of the 1930s, working in emigration in Moscow on a biography of Stalin, Trotsky attempted to recall the year of his expulsion from the Politburo and could not. Among the drafts of the books on Stalin in the Trotsky archive there is the following note in pencil. Quote, It seems that already in 1927 I was no longer a member of the Politburo. Verify. End quote. Trotsky. End footnote. The situation changed abruptly toward the end of 1925, when Zinoviev and Kamenev were already beginning to be pushed aside. Stalin was breaking with them and former enemies. Trotsky on the one hand and Zinoviev and Kamenev on the other were becoming allies. Footnote. On the 9th of December, 1925, Trotsky made a note to himself, aligns with Zinoviev. It is therefore possible to refer to the formation of the left opposition as dating from December 1925. End footnote. At this point, however, they lacked a sufficient common platform to serve as the basis for a true opposition, and in addition could not openly admit that the issue at stake was a power struggle. To do so would have signified defeat from the start, since the party rank and file would most certainly have supported the current party leadership, rather than its former officials. It was essential to formulate their ideas of disagreement into a specific platform, around which it would then be possible to rally a significant number of discontented party actives. These areas of disagreement centered on domestic policy in 1926, criticism of the new economic policy from the left. It would be wrong to assert that the dispute between the Bolshevik party activists and the oppositionists, who were by that time justifiably labeled, quote, leftists, was fabricated, or that Trotsky, Zinoviev, and Kamenev specifically joined together for the purpose of defending a left wing, parenthesis, rather than right wing, in parenthesis, position by chance. The sincerity of Trotsky's position cannot be doubted. Trotsky had always been on the left wing of the revolutionary spectrum, but the historian attempting to explain why the, quote, rightists, Zinoviev and Kamenev, who had opposed the Bolshevik uprising in October of 1917, later turned up in the left opposition of Trotsky, while Bukharin, the former leader of the left communists and a supporter of the Revolutionary War, was head of the right wing of the party, which at that time included Stalin as well, runs into enormous difficulties. The opposition formed in 1926 criticized the Soviet government's domestic policies on a whole series of issues. In the main, however, the opposition came out against the private economy, i.e. against NEP, although the criticism was leveled not against the new economic policy per se, but rather against the, quote, private owner. Thus, in IUG Pyatakov, in a, quote, draft resolution on the economic question, end quote, referred to the, quote, growing economic influence of the kulak and the establishment of a union of the middle-level peasant, parenthesis, Serednyak, end parenthesis, with private capitalistic elements, end quote. Alarm on the score of the increase in, quote, prosperous peasant households, end quote, was sounded also by Evgeny Preobrazhensky. They seem to suggest that if the new economic policy, which represented a compromise between capitalist and socialist forms of economic ownership, did lead to the gradual establishment of a capitalistic market economy, then it was necessary to bring an end to the NEP. If an individual peasant economy in the countryside gave rise to a prosperous peasantry, while a collective peasant economy resulted in an impoverished peasantry, then it was necessary to eliminate the individual peasant economy. And although the opposition did not openly call for this, beginning in 1928, Stalin took the demands of the oppositionists to their logical end. By itself, however, a platform based on domestic policy was not enough, as in 1918 a foreign policy issue was needed as its pivotal point. Originally, the opposition attempted to unleash debate on the subject of the general strike in England, but the documents distributed by the opposition on this issue and signed by prominent party members were so badly written as to be incomprehensible, and the affair on the whole turned out to be most unfortunate and even ridiculous. Footnote: in July 1926, the opposition distributed, over the signatures of Zinoviev, Kamenev, Pyatakov, and Krupskaya, a resolution proposed to the July plenum by the opposition on the general strike in England. End footnote. The oppositionists chose not to return to this topic. The oppositionists then attempted to formulate their differences with the government on issues relating to the Comintern. But this rather esoteric debate was impenetrable for the average party member beyond the inner party circles. A distant and incomprehensible issue could not be transformed into material for an oppositionist platform. It is possible that nothing would have come of these efforts to find a foreign policy platform issue. But then at last the revolution in China, long under preparation, began. And this event was more than adequate for the opposition. The revolution in China became the pivotal issue of the conflict. Everything followed the pattern of 1918, with Lenin's place occupied by Stalin and Trotsky in Bukharin's position. Like the left communists in 1918, the left position convinced the party masses that Soviet government policy with regard to the Chinese Revolution would lead directly to the revolution's defeat. Footnote: a substantial number of documents distributed by the oppositionists were devoted to this subject. The articles written on this subject by Trotsky alone would fill a volume of several hundred pages. For a list of unpublished Russian language documents in Trotsky's archive at Harvard dealing with the revolution in China, see the Kommunistcheskaya Oppositsiya. End footnote. Like Lenin in 1918, Stalin was unwilling to take the risk, since Stalin understood that active intervention in Chinese affairs would inevitably lead to a conflict with Japan, for which the Soviet Union was clearly unprepared. Finally, just as Lenin had done in his time, Stalin sacrificed a revolution abroad, in China in this case, for the sake of a truce analogous to that brought about by the Brest-Litovsk Treaty. The Chinese Revolution did suffer defeat, but time was gained, and the first serious conflict with Japan broke out only in 1938. Footnote. It was only in 1937 that creation of a strong industrial base in the Urals, the Far East, Siberia, Kazakhstan, and Central Asia was begun. Today, that fact is usually cited as evidence of the foresight of the Soviet leadership in fairly predicting the war with Germany and the consequent evacuation of industry during the war years. Approaching the end of the 30s, the Soviets' primary foreign enemy was Japan. In the summer of 1937, Japan launched an attack on China, an event that represented a serious foreign policy defeat for the Soviet government, and which had been attempting to strengthen its position in China. In July, the Japanese seized Peking. In November, they took Shanghai, and in December, Nanking. By October of 1938, the major industrial centers and most important railroad lines of China were controlled by Japan. The Soviet Union, for its part, occupied Mongolia. In September of 1937, a confrontation began between the two armies that led to local conflicts on at least two occasions. At the end of March 1938, in the region of Lake Kazan, where troops continued to fight until the 9th of August, and in May 1939 along the Khalkhin-Gol River in Mongolia, where the conflict was contained only through the intervention of Germany, shortly after the signing of the Ribbentrop-Molotov Pact on the 16th of September 1939. The creation of a second industrial base in the eastern regions of the Soviet Union was thus occasioned exclusively by the desire to guarantee an economic base near a potential military front. End footnote. There is not adequate space here to analyze the real and imaginary differences between the domestic and foreign policy stands of Stalin's government and Trotsky's opposition. It is sufficient to indicate that Stalin resolved the developing problem more gracefully than Lenin had a decade earlier. Having only begun to expel the oppositionists from the party, Stalin succeeded in obtaining their agreement to capitulate and cease their factional activities. Footnote. The opposition capitulated on the 10th of December 1927 after a number of its active members were arrested, and the party Congress adopted a resolution on the incompatibility of oppositionist activity with party membership. End footnote. Further events provide a textbook image of Stalin's tactics. His next step was to incorporate the program of his capitulating opponents in its entirety into his own arsenal, thus depriving them of their only weapons in their fight against the government. In addition, he went even further in the realization of his new program than had the oppositionists. He did not merely limit the Netman's options, but abolished the NEP altogether as such. Stalin did not stop at the imposition of restrictive measures against the peasantry, but implemented forced collectivization. As a result, Stalin's victory over the opposition was absolute. Politically and ideologically, the opposition was destroyed. Their physical destruction would come somewhat later, and with Trotsky's expulsion from the USSR in January 1929, the left opposition disappeared from the Soviet Union forever. That's the end of the piece. Thank you so much for listening.